2. We all know that living conditions on Mars are pretty harsh right now. But what if we made some changes? What if we colonized the Red Planet and made it habitable for humans? Welcome to Living on Mars, where we explore the possibilities of making life on the Red Planet not just possible, but actually comfortable. Let's get started. So first things first, let us talk about the elephant in the room, or should I say, the giant red in the sky. The biggest obstacle to living on Mars is definitely its atmosphere. Unlike Earth, Mars has an extremely thin atmosphere that is mostly composed of carbon dioxide and doesn't contain much oxygen. This means that if you tried to take a breath on Mars, your lungs would literally collapse. And also, Mars doesn't have a global magnetic field like Earth does, which means that it doesn't have the protection from harmful solar radiation. So, if you wanted to live on Mars, you would need to build some kind of shelter to protect yourself from the elements. One solution could be to create artificial habitats. These could be domes or bubbles that are made out of a strong material, like metal or plastic, and filled with air and oxygen. We've seen this in a lot of science fiction movies, like The Martian or Interstellar. In fact, we've already started to build these habitats on Earth. They're called biospheres, and they're self-sustaining environments that can support human life. One example is the Biosphere 2 in Arizona, which was built in the 1990s and is still standing today. It's a giant glass dome that covers 1 acre of land, and it's home to a variety of plants and animals. There's even a small town nearby that was built specifically to support the Biosphere 2 project. Of course, building these habitats on Mars would be much more challenging, since we don't have the same resources as we do on Earth, but it's definitely possible. We just need to figure out how to transport the materials from Earth to Mars efficiently. One way we could do this is by using space elevators. A space elevator is basically a cable that connects the Earth to space. It's not quite possible yet, but it's definitely something that we're working towards. Once we have space elevators, we could use them to lift materials off the Earth and assemble them on Mars. Another option would be to mine the materials on Mars itself. We know that there are a lot of minerals on Mars that could be used to build these habitats. So if we could figure out how to mine them and process them, then we could build everything we need right on Mars. Alright, so once we've got our habitats sorted, let's talk about food. If you want to live on Mars, you can't just rely on shipping food from Earth. You need to grow your own food. Luckily, Mars has a lot of potential for agriculture. There's a lot of water ice on Mars, and we know that plants need water to grow. Also, there's a lot of minerals on Mars that could be used as fertilizers. Of course, there are also challenges when it comes to growing food on Mars. For example, gravity is much weaker than on Earth, so plants might not grow the same way. We'd also need to find a way to grow food without soil. One solution could be to use hydroponics or aeroponics. With hydroponics, plants are grown in water instead of soil. And with aeroponics, plants are suspended in the air and their roots are sprayed with water and nutrients. Both methods are already being used on Earth to grow food, so we know that they work. They'd also be a great option for growing food on Mars, because they use much less water than traditional agriculture. And water is a precious resource on Mars. Speaking of water, let's talk about that. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of water ice on Mars. So technically, we could just melt that ice and use it for drinking and farming. However, we'd need to find a way to purify it first because it's not safe to drink. Water on Mars is also frozen for most of the year, so we'd need to find a way to keep it liquid. One solution could be to build greenhouses that maintain a constant temperature, or to use geothermal energy to heat the water. We don't know much about geothermal energy on Mars, but it's definitely something that we could explore. Another option would be to import water from Earth. This would be really expensive, but it's definitely possible. We'd probably need to use large tankers to transport the water from Earth to Mars, and then we'd need to find a way to store it on Mars. One solution could be to use underground caves or aquifers to store the water. We know that there are a lot of caves on Mars, so this is definitely an option. We don't know much about Martian aquifers, but it's definitely something that we could explore. Alright, so now that we've got food and water sorted, let's talk about another essential resource: energy. We all know that fossil fuels are not an option on Mars, because we V8 already used up all those on Earth. So, we'd need to find a renewable source of energy to power our homes and vehicles. One option would be solar power. Of course, there are challenges when it comes to using solar power on Mars. For example, days are longer on Mars than on Earth, so we'd need to develop new technologies to regulate the amount of sunlight that we receive. We'd also need to find a way to store the energy that we collect, because there are no electrical wires on Mars. One solution could be to use batteries to store the energy, or to use thermal energy storage systems. These systems use materials that absorb heat during the day and release it at night. They are already being used in some parts of the world to provide a reliable source of energy, even when the sun is unshining. Another option would be to use nuclear power. This isn't as popular as it once was on Earth because of the risk of nuclear waste, but it's definitely something that we could explore on Mars. After all, we don't have the same restrictions as we do on Earth. We could use nuclear power to generate electricity for our homes and even to power our vehicles. Of course, we do need to make sure that the nuclear waste is properly contained, so that it doesn't contaminate the Martian soil. Okay, so we've got our food, water, and energy sorted. Now let's talk about transportation. We can't all be driving Teslas on Mars, so we'd need to develop new technologies for getting around. One option would be to use electric vehicles powered by the solar energy that we collected. We do need to develop new vehicles specifically for Mars. Since the gravity is much weaker than on Earth, the vehicles would also need to be able to drive on Martian terrain, which is full of rocks and dust. Another option would be to use drones or other flying vehicles to get around. This would be especially useful for long distances, since there are no roads on Mars. We could use drones to deliver goods, or even people from one settlement to another. Of course, we do need to make sure that these flying vehicles are safe to operate since there's no air traffic control on Mars. Finally, let's talk about entertainment. Living on Mars isn't all going to be work and no play. We'd need to find ways to have fun on the Red Planet too. One option would be to build parks and playgrounds where kids could run around and play. We'd also need to find ways to entertain adults. Maybe we could build bars and restaurants where people could socialize, or maybe we could even build casinos to bring a little bit of Vegas to Mars. Of course, we'd need to make sure that these places are safe for humans. After all, we don't want anyone getting hurt while they're having fun. And that's it. That's how we can live on Mars today. Of course, this is just a brief overview, and there are definitely a lot of details that we did uncover, but the main point is that it's possible. We could live on Mars today if we really wanted to. Do you think you could live on Mars? Let me know in the comments below. And check out my other videos about space and technology. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.